Hello, everyone. I'm Kyle Simpson. Most of you know me as Getify. I'm here today with one of my coworkers at Tabnine, Yotam Shinan. Thanks for joining us, Yotam.
Thank you for having me, Kyle. It's an honor to be here.
So I thought we'd get together today, Yotam, and play around a bit with React. It's not like React is new; it's been around a long time, and where we're kind of going with this is to play around with the switch in state management from like the traditional class-based way that React components used to be to the kind of over the last couple of years the new hip way of doing things with functional components and hooks and stuff like that. So it's not a lot of groundbreaking space here, but I thought we would take our time digging through some of the nuances of that. So what we're going to start with here is this simple little movie list app that we built. And you can see that here in our CodePen project. So thanks to our friends over there at CodePen for providing the ability to like spin up a whole like React project like right in the browser. It's kind of cool. Um, so Tom, what we're gonna play with here is an app that actually has a bit of a bug in it, and we're gonna discover that bug by playing with it for a moment. So I know what the bug is. Yotam doesn't know what the bug is. He's about to be surprised by that. But what we have here is we have this database of movie information that we downloaded, from somewhere online. It was free or whatever, and we put it in this like 6 MB large JSON file, and that's one of the assets that we've loaded into this CodePen. So when we do an API lookup, we're actually just fetching a result from a JSON file. It's not like it's hitting a real API, but it's kind of faking it for our purposes. And it's not a
Good enough
complete,
for us.
it's good enough for us, right? Like it's not a complete list of all movies, and that's actually going to be useful to us to be able to illustrate. So the way that this little demo app works is that you search for a movie by its title and it'll give you all the matching ones from the database. But if you search for a title that it doesn't match, then it just throws up a big error message that says movie not found. So let's try this. This is my favorite example as I was helping work on this app. Tom, let's have you search for Toy Story. My kids love the Toy Story
I
Pixar
used to
movies.
love
So
that too. Well, I mean, I still do.
we're all kids at heart, right? So Toy Story here.
So, Toy Story.
And you can see that we did indeed find the 4 Toy Story movies that are all there. And you can see that we've got those little thumbs up icons next to it. This is just sort of like, it's not going to persist that anywhere on a database or something, but like if I really, really liked Toy Story 2, for example, let's click the thumb icon, the thumbs up next to Toy Story 2.
Toy Story 2. Oh, great. Now it's clicked.
Yeah, it saved the state of that. In fact, if you go and now change the search to Toy Story 2, you'll see that it'll narrow the list down, but we'll still see it's still got our thumbs up,
Still liked.
right? That we liked it, if you will. So let's try a different movie. Let's search for like Lion King.
Oh, I used to love that too.
It's another great one. The cartoon was way better than the live action, in my opinion, but
Definitely. Don't even get me started on.
let's just not even debate that here, okay? So, all right, but so now we've got a couple of Lion King movies. You'll notice that Toy Story is not on here. Let's search again for Toy Story. Make sure that it still has.
So, Toy Story again, and Toy Story 2 is still clicked.
It still has our clicked state, which is good, right? But now let's try something different. Let's search for another, pretty popular favorite movie. Let's search for Harry Potter.
Harry Potter. How come there's no Harry Potter in this list? It's like one of my all-time favorites.
I know. I don't know how that didn't end up in whatever export of
That's a
the
shame.
movie
That's a
database
shame.
that we got. It is a shame, right? Those are good movies. But now that we have, you know, not found a movie, we've actually hit a different state of our application, which was there was no movie list to render. Now let's try Toy Story again.
Okay. So Toy Story. Oh, damn.
And there's the bug
And we lost
because
the state here.
it's forgotten that state, right? So it was remembering that state even as we were reloading different items into our list. It was remembering that state. But as soon as we got into this kind of different context where the movie list had been completely unrendered, the component had been unmounted to use the React speak, then all of a sudden that state went away. Now, this is not going to be like a groundbreaking new bug that nobody's ever heard of before. Most listeners are probably going to have recognized this as like, oh, well, when you unload a component, of course, it throws away any local state. So what I thought we would do, I intentionally set us up to have this problem because over the course of several, I think, videos that we're going to have together, we're going to explore various different options for fixing that, for some definition of fixing. But in just this first kind of intro video while we're playing around, I thought that it would be fun for us to try the usual approach, the most typical or common approach. And then as we come back in later video segments together, I want us to try different approaches, which I think have maybe a bit more of a solid kind of, more maintainable and more appropriate architecture to them. So if you do any Googling for like, my component lost its state or some variation of that error message, and I should state for the context of everyone listening, you probably know me as not really much of a framework guy. This project is like the first real like React code that I've ever done much writing about. I don't do a lot with frameworks. So I'm literally in the boat of like React beginner. And I have this bug and I'm like, okay, I'm going to Google search for it because probably somebody has talked about this before or done it before. And or
Here
I'll
and
tweet.
there.
Yeah, somebody's run across this in the hundreds of millions of React apps that have been written. Well, of course, you find a bunch of Stack Overflow explanations for it. I tweeted it out, and a bunch of people, and almost everybody gave me the same initial response. And that's the thing that I want us to like play around with here. Almost everybody, to them, the obvious answer is, well, if your
What
child
was it?
component is losing its state when it gets unmounted, then that means that the child component shouldn't be storing the state, that the state should be stored in the parent component, and therefore it wouldn't get lost when it got unmounted. That was kind of
That
the,
makes sense, I guess.
I think at first glance, it probably does make some sense. But the whole purpose of our videos together is to actually ask, does that really make sense? Is that really the right answer? So let's first do it the way that pretty much everybody starts in solving a problem like this, which is we could sort of refer to this as like hoisting the state up out of that child component. So let's look around a little bit at the code that we've set up and get people kind of used to what we've got. Maybe make the code area a little bit bigger for right now. And let's just look at what we've got. So let's start with app.js. We want
Okay.
to activate that tab. And you notice this is very, very straightforward. This is how most all React apps are set up. You have this like app component, capital A, app component. And here we didn't need any like complexity with routing. So no, I don't have like React router or anything fancy.
That's the basic app that you get when you're using Create React App.
Yes, exactly right. Like this is literally like the hello world of doing React apps. We've got one page that we want to load up that we call home. So you see there on line, 7, I think it is, it just loads the home component. It doesn't even need to tell it to do anything. It's like just load the one component, right?
That's pretty straightforward.
So let's look at in the pages directory, let's look at the home JSX component.
Hmm.
And you'll notice that this one, we are defining this component in the what you might call like the old school way of doing it. This is class-based coding. Okay.
With
And
constructor and super.
exactly, like the constructor approach. This is the way React kind of initially rolled out. Actually, it was a little bit more even primitive than this because we didn't have the class syntax in JavaScript at the time that React was first released. Later, it was added actually in large part one of the big reasons for JavaScript to add the class keyword was because frameworks like React were doing this at such a large scale. So, but this is the kind of code that you did kind of early on, say 3 to 5 years back in React. You saw a lot of this like class-based thing. And the thing about class components, class style components, is that we have these different what are called life cycles. So if you scroll down a little bit to past some of these event handlers, past search handler, you'll notice that we have this first one here, this component did mount. That's one of several.
That's a famous one.
That's a special method name that like React knows to look for part of its lifecycle management. And the point of this video is not to like explain all the internals of React, because quite frankly, I don't know all the internals of React. Remember, I'm kind of a newbie here, right? But I'm just like illustrating that we're doing the class-based syntax because what it offered you by, if you defined a method that matched a special name, you got to hook into a special part of the lifecycle of any component. In this case, the component did mount is like right after it mounted, right after it rendered your component for the first time. That was called mounting. And as soon as that happened, it would fire whatever code was in the component did mount method. And here you'll see that's where we're doing my like fake, I mean, it's real Ajax, but I'm doing this fake API call. I'm just grabbing some data from our asset JSON file here. But that's just like saying after we render the home page component for the first time, go off and grab that 6 megabytes of JSON and get it ready. And you'll notice here that I'm using the set state, this dot set state on what is that, line 49 there. You'll see this dot set state, and then
Yes,
yeah,
that's
exactly.
yes.
So that's kind of like the original, at least as far as I can tell, like the original way that a component can save some information for future renderings of itself, is it can store these things in this like hidden state object, and you access them, you like add to that hidden state object or update it by calling this set state method. The way it works is you provide an object, and each property in that object is like one of those named slots in your state that you're just updating with some new value. So that's all I'm doing here is whenever we got the JSON back, line 49, we just kind of save it into our state. Now, that's important to note.
That is here.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. We set it up in the constructor, and then we pushed it in with the set state method. Now, it's important to note that the thing that's happening is that's an unchanging, like immutable state. That's the state of our database API, if you will. The state where we're storing the click of those like buttons, those thumb up buttons, is not being pushed into that same spot. It's being managed by the movie list. And you may ask, which is our child component that we'll look at in just a moment. You may ask yourself, why wouldn't we normally just stick that data in there? Well, if this were a more real app, you might ask the question, is the thing that I'm doing as a user something that should be persisted on the server in some way, like saved to my record? Liking is one of those interesting kind of gray areas, and it's kind of why I chose this, because you could certainly make the case that I would want to save the fact that I had liked a movie. But you could also make the case that there are what I would call ephemeral UI states that don't make sense to persist at all in any kind of like global data store or off the client on the server anywhere. So for example, if we were dealing with a calendar widget, and you click around in a calendar, you click several months into the past or into the future or something like that. So that calendar widget has some local UI state, which you want to like save in case you need to re-render the calendar widget. But you're not going to save that in any like persistable way. And that's not like saved into the database. That's ephemeral UI state is what I call it. And so these like buttons are kind of like, they sort of sit in between the data that would be definitely persisted, like I'm definitely want to save the fact that you did this. Here's another example of like potentially ephemeral state. Might be something like what's going on in your shopping cart, okay? Because you may not want your e-commerce site to save that shopping cart in case somebody abandons it and they come back. They may not want it, or you may want it to. So it's this like gray area of, do we want things to be saved? And so in our app, the way it's currently set up, we thought that the liking of these movies might not be something that would be saved, persisted. It might be more of that ephemeral UI state. And so that's the way it's organized right now, is that the subcomponent, the movie list that we're going to look at here, that thing is where the state of all those like buttons is being saved. So let's do that. Let's actually scroll down just a little bit so you can see the render here. you'll notice that in this render function, which again is one of those lifecycle methods, this is the thing that's called every time we need to re-render a component. And, some of this stuff is important and some of it's kind of like not all that important to our discussion. You can see there on, what is that, line 63, that's where we conditionally decide to render that error message if that's been set. We have our form with our, event handlers and stuff. But really kind of the important thing, I think, starts down on line 78. This is where we're asking conditionally, do we have any search results? And if we do, render line 79, our child component, the movie list. And we give it the list of movies. That's what this.state.query results is, our list of movies, if you will.
This is pretty much what they came up with React for.
Yes, to be able to compose a child component inside of a parent component. And, basically, a child component is kind of just like a function call where the attributes in the JSX here are just parameters that are getting passed along. They're the props, if you will, that are getting passed along. So we're going to invoke this movie list component. And the very first time that we do that, it's mounted. So it's going to call its component did mount lifecycle. So let's go into movie list and look at that one. So again, we have a class here, and we don't have anything to do on initial mount. So we don't see a component did mount, but the default one, of course, would be invoked if we had it. You'll notice here that that's where I've got a liked items on line 7, as you've highlighted there. That's where we're going to store an array. And the choice I made here was to just store an array of each one of the movies in the database had a unique numerical ID. So we're just basically storing this object with all these numeric IDs in it. And then every time we render a movie, we ask, have we saved a record in this liked items object with that same ID? And if so, then we're going to render the button as having been already liked. So let's scroll down and look at how that's done. Down in the render method, you'll notice there on line 26. That's where we're asking, is there already a record in that liked items object of the item.id? And if there is, then we render it as the line 27 is where we're rendering it. The little I there is like the grayed out liked one, versus line 29, which is the actual button that you can click. So we're just deciding, have we already rendered it or not? And that's how we're choosing to do it. Okay.
Sounds great. Now we just need to fix it.
We just need to fix the bug, right? Like it's obvious and easy. Now that we see how the organization works, let's fix the bug. So the obvious answer that a lot of people suggested was, well, you're saving that liked items in the movie list. Why don't we just hoist the liked items object exactly as is? We don't need to change any of it. Why don't we just hoist the liked items object out of our movie list component and out into the parent component, which in this case is the home component, right?
The home component.
So why don't we do that?
And for that, we will need another property in the class object, I guess.
Yes, exactly. So let's go up to the constructor where we set up our state for our home object. And let's just add a liked items here instead of where we were doing it. And make it an empty object. Okay. And then let's go into the movie list again. Mm-hmm. We'll come back on and do the setting in a minute. So let's take out the this.state. So they're in the, actually I think we can take out the whole constructor now that we're not going to do any local state here. It's just the default constructor at that point.
So bye-bye.
Okay. So our event handler here is an important question because we were doing line 8, we were doing this.setState. But we can't do that anymore because we are not managing our own state. So we're going to have needed to have a method basically passed into us, if you will, some kind of method passed into us that we can access, as well as the liked items being passed in. So I said we got rid of the constructor. Actually, I think we need to bring back it, but let's write the constructor from scratch this time. Well, okay, so we can undo it, but this is illustrative of why we're going to need the constructor, because we're going to need to pass in the liked items object, but we're also going to need to pass in a function. So let's do that. Let's write a constructor
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to pass those in via the props. That's what the whole purpose of props is to pass in data from a parent to a child. So let's make a constructor with the um, props parameter.
Mm-hmm. What are we going to
And
have
then
here?
in JavaScript classes, you got to call super with the props. So let's do super with props to make sure that the full class hierarchy is initialized. And then we know that we're going to be passing in two things. We're going to be passing in a liked item. So let's save these as class instance values. Let's just say this dot liked items equals props dot liked items. We'll just keep the names the same to keep it real simple.
Props dot, okay.
Yeah, props dot liked item. Props is an object that represents any of the parameters that we would have passed in.
Makes sense.
Okay. And then we've got on our next line, let's save off the function that would have been passed in, which is going to be, we'll call this add item. So we're going to say this dot add item. Actually, let's rename it to add liked item. That way it's a little bit more descriptive. Add liked item. And that's going to be equal to props dot add liked item. I think we might have had a
Item.
typo there.
Yep.
There we go.
Okay.
So again, just to reset, what we're doing is we would have received something via the props, and we would have saved it off into one of our instance properties. Now let's ask whether or not that's even necessary. Scroll down to the render method, if you will. You'll notice that the render method still has access to a this.props.
Which we don't have anymore.
Well, we do have this
Oh, we do.
props. That's kind of one of those magic things that React is giving us, is that every lifecycle method still has access to whatever that list of props was that it was initially constructed with. So technically, our constructor isn't actually necessary. We don't have to save them off. We can if that feels more readable to you to like very clearly. But you can see right there on line, what is that, line 29, you can see
29.
that we're accessing this.props in our render method. We're not accessing a class instance. We're accessing it directly on props. So we could have done the exact same thing in the other places as well. So this is kind of like optional. If you want the constructor there, if you find that style more readable to like manually pull those things off, that works. Otherwise not. But anyway, let's go to the handle like method. And that this.set state on line 20, that needs to change now. That's the thing that now needs to invoke our add liked item method. So we're going to say basically this dot add liked item, and we'll say that the signature of that method is to just receive the item ID. So we can take out all that liked items dot 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 all that object stuff. Just take all that out and pass only as an argument a single thing of item ID.
And that's it?
Yeah, just actually take it even off the curly braces. We're not even going to pass an object. We're going to just literally pass the item ID.
So easy.
Yeah. We want to make our lives easier, so.
Item ID. Do we
I think
have it
it's
stored already
capital.
somewhere?
It's a capital D.
Is it?
Yeah. Actually, that's being set up right above it on line 18. You can see. I'm sorry,
right.
line 19 right there. We're getting that off of our DOM element, so we have that item ID and we can just pass it directly in.
All right,
Okay,
great.
and then we need to make a couple of one other little update, which is on line 30, where it says this dot state dot liked items. That one's now going to just be this dot liked items. Now again,
Right,
if we didn't do the constructor approach, if we kind of took the shortcut here, then instead of saying this dot liked items, we'd be saying this dot props dot liked items. Either way. we have a reference to this object.
So should I add the props here?
I think we'll, for just the purposes of our kind of first video here together, let's just leave the constructor in place. But I just wanted to
Okay.
point out that if you take off the constructor, if you don't save them as class instance properties, then you can always still get at those inputs via this.props in any of your lifecycle methods or whatever that you need.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So we've made the change that we need in movie list, but we need to make some more changes up in the home. Right? Because
So we're back there.
we're back here. We do have an object that we can stick our liked items in. So let's skip down outside of the constructor and add that just exactly like we're doing with the handle change there. We're going to say add liked item.
I like that.
These are static properties that we're assigning an arrow function to, and so it's kind of
So it's gonna get the props, right?
no. This one's going to remember we're passing an item ID here. That'll be the parameter here.
Okay. All right. So something like that.
We'll just call it item ID, but yeah, exactly. That's the parameter name instead of event or props.
Okay.
Exactly. There we go.
All right.
I think there needs to be no space between the equals and the arrow there.
Sorry, that's a typo. My bad.
There we go.
Okay. And now we need to call now we need to use the set state.
This is the line we're going to do. Yeah, this dot set state. And we're going to open up an object, and then we're going to say liked items, which is the property name that we're updating. And we'll make that another object inside it. So do a colon and then the curly braces there.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe like go to the next line so that we've got it like cleaner, because we're going to type a few things inside of liked items. So
Okay. So like that?
yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Yeah. And so inside of that that innermost object, make ourselves a new empty line there. Inside of that innermost object, we're going to want to type in a dot dot dot, because we're going to want to spread the existing liked items object into it.
Okay.
This is basically just the syntactic way of copying the object. So we're doing dot 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 and then this dot state dot liked items.
State liked items.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
And then a comma, and then we're going to do a computed property here in the name of the item ID. So we're going to do square brackets, and inside of that type item ID.
Mm-hmm.
And then outside of the bracket, do a colon true, because we're just going to, by convention, we're just going to store property name and the Boolean true value. There you go. And then clean it up by going to the next line with those curly braces or whatever. Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Okay, and so we have our liked items in our state, and we have our add liked item function. We now need to pass both of those into the child component. So if we go down to the render function of this class, keep going down.
There it is.
Yep, so on that line, what is that? Line 66, I guess. On that line, after the movies attribute, we're going to add these two extra attributes. These are things that are going to get added into props there. So down on, sorry, 86 is what I meant.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense.
I misread the line number. There we go.
Okay. So we're talking about here. So we need movies, and we need to add more attributes.
Yeah, exactly. Because these attributes, they kind of act like, I mean, they literally are properties on the props object. They act as the arguments to the function, if you will. So we add them as attributes here. It's kind of it's the React or the JSX way of doing function inputs, if you will.
Okay.
So the first one we want to do here is liked items.
Mm-hmm.
And do an equals and then the curly brace. And then we're going to do this dot state dot liked items.
Okay.
And then the next attribute that we want to add is our function, the add liked item.
Add liked item and
And that'll be just this dot add liked item.
liked item. So we can just take this and add it here. Oh no, sorry, my mistake.
Yeah, no, it's going to be add liked item.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
like that.
exactly.
Okay, we'll take it here. There we go. Okay.
So now we've got our 3 inputs to our movie list. And just to refresh, let's go back into movie list now and see where those 2 things are being passed in. In our constructor here, line, what is that, 13 and 14, we're basically taking those off of the props object. So those were there because of the way we did them in the JSX. They're now coming in and we're saving them as instances. And I already can spot that we're going to have a little bit of a bug, but just put a mental bookmark here. We'll come back to that in a moment. We'll see how that bug is. But now that we have those on available to the child, then if you scroll down a bit into the render, you recall that we're using those. Yeah, what is that? Line 29, sorry, line 30. We're using this dot liked items, and then line 20 is where we're using the this dot add liked item function.
Right.
So we've passed those in from the parent, passed them down to the child. So just in summary, or kind of in review here, that's the typical way that people say fix the bug where your child item is managing state and gets unmounted and the state is lost, is they say, well, just store it in the parent, whatever the parent is, that doesn't get unmounted, and then pass it down. And of course, if you think about our simple app, that's not that big of a deal, but the more complex your app is, you may have that the parent could get unmounted in certain cases, or even the grandparent or whatever. So you often find yourself having to hoist your state way, way up the tree, not just one level, but like way up the tree.
Is there a limit? Is there a limit in the family chain of how many parents? I mean, how many generations can props go down and up the scale?
There's no limit because as we're seeing here, the pattern that we're talking about and that is kind of generally suggested as the best practice, if you will. The pattern is essentially you have to manually pass from one parent into a child. So you can imagine if you were to hoist this up 4 levels, well, now at each one of those generational levels, you're going to have to receive from a parent and pass into a child. And then in that child, now that child is the parent, you're going to have to receive from that and pass into the grandchild, and so on and so on. So the higher up you have to hoist, the more kind of this manual wiring of things has to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I wonder if that's if is it count as a good practice to use many so-called generations. I mean, for delivering props from a parent component to its child component.
In my opinion, and this is part of the reason why I set up the demo and our video and our discussion this way, in my opinion, moving something out of the child into the parent simply because there's no way for the child to be unmounted and still remember its stuff, that to me seems like a not best practice. It seems more like an anti-pattern, but I think it's unquestionably the most common response that we get when we search for this or we ask people is almost everybody just says, oh, we'll just stick it in the parent. And then they don't worry too much about sticking it in the parent. It only really becomes painful whenever you've had to move it up several levels and then do all of that manual wiring. And then you start to ask, yeah, do I really have to do this every time? Because it gets a lot harder on maintenance. You forget one level, you add a property and you add it to 3 of the 4 and you forget it and somehow it's missing or whatever. So that idea of taking a parent and passing it down into the child and then doing that even multiple levels, that sort of has this term that I've seen people use, which is props drilling, meaning like drilling down level after level after level with your props or whatever. And so I think props drilling itself would be considered a not good practice, but the only reason people did it in the first place is because there is this, I think, conceptual problem in component frameworks, which is that we've combined the idea of a component being mounted in the DOM with the idea of a component instance existing anywhere with any state. Just because you take something out of the DOM should not, in my opinion, mean necessarily that its instance has gone away, because there might be reasons why you want to remove something from the DOM temporarily and then put it back, and you might not necessarily want it to completely start over from scratch in terms of state. And so to me, that's kind of a conceptual missing piece here. And that's why I set the demo and the videos up in this way, is for us to explore that issue. One way of fixing it is having the parent manage it. I've seen other suggestions where people said, well, just save all of the child state into like local storage in the browser or something like that. That also feels like a really problematic way of doing it. Another way that people say it is, well, never unmount the child, just use CSS to hide the child, right? Because that's another way of going about this, is we don't ever remove it from the DOM. It's always there, and we just, set a CSS display on it or something. And that led to a set of suggestions that people said where the parent doesn't manage the list of items, but maybe the parent manages some Boolean flag like should show or not. And so what it passes in every time is a should show, a Boolean true or false. And then the child itself, while always still mounted, might decide not to render anything out for itself if the should show is false, for example. So you can see that there's like a dozen different ways that people try to solve this problem. I think they all kind of have their different trade-offs. But the whole purpose of our discussion in these videos is to kind of like explore this a little bit and see if there are other better ways. So where we're headed in our next set of videos is to try to address the prop drilling problem. And then eventually where we're going to get to is, does hooks solve any of this for us? Does it make any of it better? Or does it just sort of shift the problem to a different place? So that's kind of like the outline for our next couple of video segments together. But anyway, we've made our change. Let's try it. So you might, we're going to need to save all, but because of a little bug with the way projects work here, we're going to have to always make a change to our app.js just so it makes sure that it fully bundles. And I think that's just a temporary bug with CodePen projects or whatever. But so we're just making sure that we definitely got our bundle in there. Now, if you kind of drag up the window so we can actually see the movies list again, let's try it. We were trying before searching like Toy Story. So let's try that again. Let's try Toy Story.
Let's go for it. What do you say? Will it work now?
So we're going to click one of those buttons and see whether that works.
Let's choose the first one because that was the only Toy Story that I really liked.
Okay. And you notice that it's not working.
It's not working.
Or at least it seems like it's not working. Let's see whether it worked or not. Let's try change. You've clicked the button. Let's try changing our search to Lion King.
Okay.
And then let's come back. And then, after we've searched for Lion King, then let's search for Toy Story again, and let's see what happens.
Okay.
So it didn't save anything. It didn't render anything, and it didn't save anything. So there's clearly something kind of missing here.
I might have clicked that twice.
I don't think there's any undoing. We didn't put any undoing logic in there. So
right.
I don't think the clicking of the twice worked. So let's go back to the code and let's figure out why is this button no longer working.
Okay.
Because I know what the problem is. I spotted it after I said it, but I wanted to kind of leave the mistake in so that we could fix our own mistake. So let's go into movie list for a minute. So you'll notice that what's happening, and let's look at the constructor. You remember earlier in our discussion, I was saying, well, do we need the constructor? Do we not need it? And I was kind of suggesting it doesn't matter one way or the other. We left it in. Well, it turns out that this approach with using the constructor is what's introducing the bug. And that's why I wanted to kind of like leave it there so that we see the problem and then see that removing it is going to fix it.
Very
So
sneaky of you.
the problem is that on what is that line 13,
Hmm.
we're actually saving a copy of the original liked items, which is always going to be an empty object. And then in our render function down below, we're always using that original object, which never gets updated. Remember when we did our add liked item function in home.jsx, we made a copy of the object. We didn't mutate it because best practice, you don't want to like have mutable objects floating around. So the real problem here is that we are actually changing that object, but we're never referring to that object ever again because we're not reinstantiating, if you will, the thing. Actually, let's go back to the movie list. Let me prove this to you. If you'll drag back up the window, I'll prove that the state is still there. At least I hope so. Try the Harry Potter search again.
Okay. Moving
This
up.
is definitely unloaded the child component. So the next time we do a search, it's going to re-render and rerun the constructor because it's going to remount. So now try searching for Toy Story. And if my theory is correct, now we'll see the button great reflecting
You
that state.
are correct.
So you can see there that the state itself was being preserved, but the child component was not seeing those changes and never re-rendering itself. Does that make sense?
It is.
Okay. So that's this tricky little bug. It's because we're saving this kind of static reference, if you will, to the original object at the time of construction, and that thing is never getting updated to see the new state. So really the simplest fix here is we can just delete both the constructors entirely. Delete the constructor, delete the one that's commented out, just delete the constructors entirely. Because what we're going to want to favor here is actually accessing these from this.props. That way it's always the kind of new one rather than just the one at the constructor. So we've got two places to fix that. Line, what is that, line 8, we need to say this.props.addLikedItem.
Okay. This dot props dot add liked item, and let me find the other one. Have this props. No, this is okay. And this liked items.
That's the one we want
That's
to fix.
the one. So we need to add props. Okay.
So if we make sure to update app.js so we don't have a missing bundle update here.
Mm-hmm. And let's
And now if we drag our window up, cross our fingers, hopefully this should now work.
give it a moment. Okay.
All right, so let's try our search again. We'll search for Toy Story. And just click one of the buttons.
Click one. It worked.
That worked.
That worked.
Let's try Lion King.
Lion King. And now let's go back to Toy Story.
Back to Toy Story. That's still there. Now let's try Harry Potter. And finally, one last time back to Toy Story, and we're crossing our fingers.
Go. And it's working.
And there it is. Our state is still around. Okay. Hey, I'm patting myself on the back. We actually did something correct. We fixed a couple of bugs in React code. I think that's a win. And we didn't even like hack. Like we knew exactly what we were doing. We identified exactly what was wrong, and we did the correct fix to it. So,
I'm very
so I think that's
impressed,
a
Kyle.
good.
I'm very impressed.
I think that's a good place to land for this first video. We explored the various options for how we could do this. So where we're going to go next is we're going to ask, did it really make sense to stick that state out in the home component, being the only parent component there was? Maybe we should have another kind of middle component that state could stay in so that it wouldn't mix with any of the other stuff that might be in our home state. Kind of like create another scope, basically. It's kind of like creating a middle function in and a function chain or something. So that's where we'll head next to see if there's any benefit to doing that. And then eventually we're going to look at the context API, which is React's answer for how to solve the props drilling issue, make it a little bit more, a little bit more graceful. And then we're going to move into looking at hooks and seeing how to do this stuff with hooks.
I
So
can't wait.
that's our roadmap for future segments. So thanks very much for being with us in this first one. I'm Kyle. This is Yotam, and we'll see you next time.
Bye bye.